I wake most mornings before the light takes an interest in my curtains, at that uncertain hour when the refrigerator hum becomes a kind of companion and the house seems to be holding its breath, and I lie there listening to the old clock in the hallway drag its hands through the minute and to the faint rasp in my chest that arrives when the air is dry and the night has been long. It is not yet a cough, not yet a wheeze, just that gravelly music I have carried with me since the winter of '79 when I broke my nose on a patch of black ice in the Shop and Save parking lot, and ever since then I have been, as my late wife Delia used to say, a freight train with a heartbeat. I used to be embarrassed by it when we were newly married, and I'd pretend to stay awake on the sofa to spare her. But she knew every trick of mine and would tap my shoulder and say, "Harold, the remedy is not to stay awake forever," which was her way of telling me to come to bed and be a human being who needed other human beings. And for 46 years I had that permission, that soft border to my life, the sense that the worst noises I made could be absorbed by a home that loved me back. These days there's no one to give the tap, and when the noise startles me awake or scrapes a dry stripe down my throat, I reach out a hand into the dark and find nothing but the cold cotton of the empty side of the mattress. And I understand, in a way I never did when I was young, how the smallest complaint of the body becomes the loudest truth in a quiet room. On better mornings I swing my feet to the rug and sit there long enough to let the dizziness pass. And I do a little inventory that would have amused the version of me who could throw a sack of concrete over his shoulder and think nothing of it. Left. Knee tolerable, right shoulder stiff, lower back not yet mutinous, hands serviceable if treated with patience, and eyes that sharpen after the first 2 blinks. I am careful with my first steps because the kitchen tile is colder than any reason I have for rushing, and I have learned that hurrying toward anything at my age is a way of courting indignity. The kettle is an old Whistler I bought after Delia passed because I couldn't stand our fancy coffee machine chirping at me like a parakeet. And there's a comfort in choosing something that announces itself with one simple sound. I grind the beans by hand because the electric grinder makes a blue noise that reminds me of dentists, and I count my scoops and listen to the sound the spoon makes against the tin, and by the time the kettle clears its throat, I have set out the mug I like best, the one the church kids made with crooked letters that say, "Mr. H is our star." And I take that first honest sip, and some part of me that survived childhood in a drafty rented house finally believes the day has a chance of being good. There are photographs on the refrigerator that belong to different centuries of my life. Me in a short-sleeve button-down with a pocket protector, squinting next to the first used Chevy I bought with my own money. Delia in a blue dress that never stayed closed at the collar because she was too busy to bother with the top button. My daughter Claire at 13 with a volcano of hair and a smile that said she would not apologize for wanting more than our town could give. And our grandson Aiden, as a toddler, cheeks like warm biscuits, pointing at the camera as if he were calling me to attention. Somewhere along the way, the magnets got tired and some of the pictures slipped, and I left them crooked because straightening them felt like lying about how life goes. I don't pretend I haven't made my share of mistakes, but I did one thing with care. I showed up, which may not sound like much in a century that wants you to innovate and disrupt and brand yourself. But when you're born to a mother who worked nights at the laundromat and a father who solved his fear with other women's kitchens, showing up is a revolution. I showed up to the factory and then the warehouse and then the city garage where I retired after 38 winters of salt dust in my lungs, and I showed up to Little League games even when our boy couldn't swing on time, and to band recitals even when Claire squeaked her clarinet like a cupboard door, and to Sunday dinner with my tie off center because Delia liked the pageantry of the thing even if the roast was overdone and the gravy had its own personality. And during the pandemic when nobody could be near anybody, I sat on the porch like a statue and waved to Aiden from the end of the driveway, just to prove that the string between us hadn't broken. The string frayed anyway, but at that time it seemed possible to keep it intact by pure stubbornness, and I mailed care packages with ridiculous items: Grandpa's favorite licorice, coin rolls for his savings jar, a Polaroid of me trying to learn the crossword on my phone, and I behaved as if the world we lost might return to us if we remembered how it had felt to belong to each other. And I am not embarrassed to say that when the first restrictions eased and we could sit at opposite ends of the picnic table, I nearly cried when he laughed at a dumb joke I made about how hot dogs were the angels of summer. It is hard to explain to people who haven't crossed into their 70s how much of your day is a ceremony designed to keep the past from swallowing you whole. I sweep the front walk even when there is nothing to sweep, because there was a time when Delia would stand at the doorway with a dish towel over her shoulder and tell me to leave the dirt to the wind, and the small ache in my shoulder as I push the broom reminds me that I am still necessary to something. I carry quarters for the soda. Machine at the hardware store, because when Aiden was little, he would run his soft hands over the buttons and decide that grape was the most serious of the flavors. And even though he is almost grown now, the part of me that buys grape carries a pocketful of afternoons we can never return to. I talk to neighbors with the willingness of a man who knows his conversations might be the last ones a person has before their surgeon calls. And I buy the Sunday paper, even though the news is faster and thinner on a phone, because I don't trust a world that can vanish when the battery dies. I don't say any of this to my daughter because Claire has her own mountains to move, working 2 jobs and counting down the tuition bills as if she could sweat them into smaller numbers, and I am proud of her even when her voice takes on the clipped tone of someone who wakes up already late for the rest of her life, though I'd be lying if I said I didn't miss the version of her who used to call just to tell me about the sky. Somewhere along the way, the world's idea of fun began to advertise itself as speed and spectacle and the humiliation of whoever couldn't keep up, and I learned to live alongside it without liking it much. I have a phone that does what they all do, and I learned to text with both thumbs like the teenagers in line at the pharmacy, and I let Claire put my name on 6 apps so we could share our location and grocery lists and photos, but I never stopped feeling that all those little cameras were looking for a moment when I was less than my best so they could memorialize it. And I told Aiden once, when he was still short enough to look up at me with his whole face, that not every laugh was the kind you wanted to hear again, and that sometimes the machine didn't know the difference between a kindness and a cruelty. He told me I worried too much, that people liked seeing real life, and I almost said that the people who like watching real life generally prefer it to be someone else's. Instead, I said what grandfathers say when they know the bridge they need to cross hasn't been built yet. If you love a person, protect their dignity like it's your own wallet, because once it's stolen, the best you can do is cancel the cards and pretend you didn't keep anything priceless in there. I don't know if he heard me, because my wisdom arrived wrapped in slow words, and the world he lives in pays by the second. I keep the old recliner even though the springs are beginning to confess, and most afternoons I sit there with the television, murmuring some ball game or documentary, and I half doze in that unreliable way older men sleep, with one ear open and the body ready to rescue you from your own airway. And if I'm honest, there are moments when the snore comes out of me like a stranger's bark, and I wake ashamed without knowing who asked me to be ashamed. Delia had a sweet way of making my noise into a joke we shared, and she'd nudge me and say, "That's enough thunder for one county herald." And I'd say something dumb about clearing the skies for the corn, and the whole exchange would remind me that marriage is 1,000 tiny amnesties, but the chair is less forgiving, and the ideas that come to you when you wake alone are seldom charitable to your own heart. I try to keep to a schedule because the doctor says routine is the rope we hold while the river rises. So I make the bed, though no one sees it, and I eat the oatmeal, though I resent it, and I take my walk around the block, though my right calf complains, and I have found that if I accomplish 3 small things before noon, the afternoon recognizes me as its rightful owner. Still, when the sun slopes west and the shadows lengthen across the living room and the house begins to sound like a shell you hold to your ear, a man may fall asleep whether he means to or not. And when I do it with the innocence of a farm dog, if innocence can sound like a chainsaw. I am not naive about what it is to be an old man in a family, where the budget lives on the edge of a knife and the calendar has more obligations than squares. I know I am sometimes more line item than person, a gentle utility whose function is to say, yes, when the car needs tires or the school trip costs more than anyone expected, and I say yes because it keeps me braided to them in a way I can believe in, and because I remember the months when we were young and the power bill looked like a threat, and the kindness of one older neighbor who pretended he needed his fence fixed so I could earn an extra $50 without losing my pride. And I suppose a part of me believes that giving money is a way of repairing the fence for someone else. I also know that there is a difference between help and leverage, and that when people are tired enough, they forget where that line is, and they talk to you as if the only love left in the room is the love your bank account can demonstrate. And on the days when Claire's voice gets brittle and she says, "Dad, it's just one more semester," I remind myself she is saying it to fate more than to me. But when Aiden's tone skates toward the casual disrespect that floats through the culture like pollen, when he treats me as if I were a prop in a joke, I feel a heat rise in me that I wish weren't there, an old pride that says I worked too long and loved too hard and buried too much to be reduced to a punchline. If you ask me whether he loves me, I would say yes without hesitating. But I would also say that love without a skin of reverence is a bird that keeps flying into windows, and the sound of it thudding against the glass is not a sound you forget. Evenings are my refuge when they go right. I put on the radio because the human voice without a picture still feels like company you don't have to manage, and I cook the simple things Delia taught me to do without instructions. Eggs with onions, slowly. Enough to sweeten chicken thighs that forgive you if you take them out of the oven 5 minutes late. And I sit at the small table with the old placemats we never threw away. Because they recorded 1,000 dinners, and I say grace in a way that would not satisfy a pastor, which is to say I thank the air for allowing me to remain in it this long. Some nights I drive the 6 minutes to Claire's place with a cake or a casserole, and we sit among the noise of their house, which I love in theory and can only tolerate in practice for about an hour before my ears start negotiating surrender, and those are the nights when Aiden is either charming or restless, and I take what I get. There are flashes when he looks up from his phone and says something real, something that proves the boy who used to stack plastic dinosaurs by color has not been fully leased out to the world, and then there are nights when my presence is just the background he edits out, and I endure it because being there is not the same as being seen, and being seen is not the same as being cherished, and at my age, you take the version you can get and call it a blessing. It will sound small to people who haven't lived long enough, but the thing I most wish to carry unchanged into the dark is the right to hold my head up in a room full of my own blood, to be granted the dignity of an old man who did the best he could, and whose flaws are not the funniest thing about him. I have learned that sleep will arrive only after I have made that wish out loud to no one, and after I have washed the cup and set it on the rack the way Delia liked, and turned the chair at a slight angle as if it were still her path to the couch, and only then do I go back to the bedroom, switch off the lamp, and tell my body it is safe to rest, though lately the house has learned a new tension, like a guitar left tuned too tightly, a vibration I feel under my feet, as if the future were clearing its throat and the old clock in the hall were about to announce a change I won't be able to ignore. It was a Sunday evening when the air in the house felt especially heavy, and after dinner at Claire's place I dozed off in the recliner, the familiar symphony of my own breathing rising into that thick rumble that no longer surprised me but always seemed to entertain others, and when I woke with a stiff neck I noticed the room was unusually quiet. My grandson Aiden looking down at his phone with that sly smile teenagers practice when they are proud of something but don't want to be caught admitting it, and I thought little of it until later that night when I opened my email on the old laptop and saw a link forwarded by one of the neighbors who still uses Facebook like it is a community bulletin board, and when I clicked it there I was, mouth open, head tilted back, snoring with such force that the comments below the video multiplied faster than I could read them. Strangers and acquaintances alike writing about how I sounded like a motorcycle, how I looked like I was already halfway in the grave, how someone should put Grandpa in the garage with the lawnmower. And though I wanted to close the screen, I couldn't, because in that moment I realized that my own flesh and blood had not only found me laughable, but had decided that the world would find me laughable too. I sat in the glow of the screen as the numbers ticked up, hundreds of views, then thousands, a cascade of cruel emojis, filling the space where dignity ought to live. And I knew without being told that the cameraman was Aiden himself, my grandson, who once clutched my hand on the way to school and asked me to promise never to let go, the same boy whose tiny voice once whispered that I was his hero, now filming me as if I were an exhibit in a zoo. When Claire came into the room to collect the dishes, she saw the look on my face and asked what was wrong, and when I showed her the video, she laughed first, a sharp laugh that tried to pass for casual, then quickly softened it with the phrase, "people," used when they don't want to take responsibility for cruelty. "Oh, Dad, it's just a joke. Don't be so sensitive." I wanted to believe her, wanted to let the words dissolve the sting, but every time I closed my eyes, I could still see the moving picture of myself transformed into a grotesque for strangers' amusement, and what hurt more was the memory of Aiden's smirk, the knowledge that he had staged this not once but deliberately, with intention, uploading it for the cheap applause of people who did not even know my name. That night I did not sleep, not because of the noise in my chest, but because of the noise in my head, a thundering chorus of shame and confusion, wondering how quickly love could turn into mockery, how easily a boy who once believed in me could decide I was worthy of ridicule. And as the hours crawled, I heard in the distance of memory the voice of my late wife telling me that laughter can heal, but it can also wound, and when it comes from your own kin, the cut never closes clean. The next morning at breakfast, Aiden strutted into the kitchen, still chuckling, imitating my snore at the table, while his parents exchanged weary smiles, as though this too were harmless entertainment, and I felt something in me bend, not break, not yet, but bend toward the realization that perhaps in this household I was no longer the grandfather who once built swing sets and paid tuition, but a relic whose flaws were more valuable as digital currency than his presence was as a human being. I tried to speak, tried to ask him why he would do such a thing, but my words landed in the soup of chatter about school schedules and grocery lists, and Claire hushed me gently, saying, "Dad, don't start," as if my protest were the greater offense than the betrayal itself. And in that instant I understood that the ground beneath me had shifted, that the bond I relied upon as a kind of anchor had been loosened, and the child who once sought my approval now sought the approval of anonymous screens, and the daughter who once depended on my guidance now regarded my discomfort as an inconvenience. That realization was the spark, the catalyst that told me my days of being simply tolerated in this family had ended, replaced by a new role I had never auditioned for, the clown they filmed, the old man they showcased, the easy target whose weaknesses were more valuable to them than his wisdom or his sacrifices. And so the line was crossed, not with an argument, not with a slammed door, but with a video that made my snoring the most helpless sound of my body into a public carnival. And though they would all insist it was nothing, that I was overreacting, I knew then that something had shifted permanently in my house, that a war had been declared without words, and that I would never again close my eyes in front of my grandson without remembering that the last time I did so, he turned me into contempt for a crowd that cheered my humiliation. The days that followed did not unfold as an awkward blip that a decent family would quietly bury under an apology and a casserole. They became a kind of season with its own weather, a damp front that settled into the rooms and made everything smell faintly of mildew and mockery, because the clip did what such clips do. It multiplied beyond anyone's intention and then returned to our doorstep in the mouths of people who had no stake in our lives other than the pleasure of naming what they recognized. And by Tuesday, the boys from Aiden's basketball team were greeting him in the driveway by mimicking the rise and fall of my chest with exaggerated snorts while he filmed them doing it. And Claire, trying to turn the moment into a parenting win, told him to cut it out with the goofy noises, then looked at me and said in that tight, managerial tone she uses with clients, "Dad, please don't take this so personally. The internet eats everything, and it passes in a day," which would be easier to believe if I hadn't seen the way people keep adding seasoning to a stew once they know the pot is already hot. I walked to church on Wednesday night for choir practice because singing used to sand down the corners of my week, and I caught two teenagers at the back of the fellowship hall showing each other something on a phone and then peeking toward me with their faces rearranged into the universal smirk of people who want you to know they know. And after rehearsal, one of the altos, kind woman, patted my shoulder and said, "You know, my husband snores too. It's nothing to be ashamed of." And I nodded as if she had named the thing, although it was not the noise I was ashamed of, but the decision by my own people to weaponize it. I asked Aidan to come by the house one afternoon when Claire was still at work, and the sun was kind enough to be honest about everything it touched. And I told him to sit, and I began with, "I love you," because I didn't want the rest of it to sound like punishment. Then I said I felt betrayed, that I was not an abstract figure or a gag reel, but his grandfather, whose hands had pushed his bicycle across the parking lot until his legs learned faith. And he nodded without listening and told me I was being dramatic, that everybody posts everything, that the comments were mostly positive, if I would learn to read them with a sense of humor. And I thought about the gym teacher who used to pretend to be tough by slapping boys on the head and calling it encouragement, and how badly a child wants to laugh along when the adult is the one drawing the ring. And I told Aidan that if he loved me, he would take the video down, but he told me that even if he did, it wouldn't matter because other people had already downloaded it, and besides, the numbers were too good now to waste. And he showed me the analytics as if data were a moral defense. And I felt in my throat a complicated ache that was not grief or fury alone, but the grief of having to be furious at someone you'd hoped to be gentle with for the rest of your life. That night he changed his phone's text alert to a loop of my snore, and I heard it buzz in his pocket while we sat at dinner, and his friends at the table, two boys with polite faces who will still grow into men who must choose who they want to be, fell into a laughing fit so long that Claire had to clap her hands and scold them like toddlers. Then she turned to me and said, "See, Dad, it's just kids." And I said nothing, because I could tell that if I spoke the words would be too heavy for the table legs. I decided to do the sensible thing an adult does when a weakness becomes intolerable in public, which is to treat it like a health problem instead of a moral scandal. So I made an appointment at the sleep clinic where a nurse with gentle eyes threaded wires along my scalp and wrapped a belt around my chest and said there was nothing unusual about severe snoring in older men, and that a CPAP might help me and help everyone around me sleep. And I nodded because the word help sounded like a boat. Then went to the pharmacy to pick up nasal strips and humidifier filters. And the young man at the counter, nice kid, really. I don't blame him for living in a world that taught him familiarity without intimacy, looked at my driver's license and said with the guileless cheer of someone who hasn't yet learned how to hold a stranger's dignity with both hands, "Hey, are you the grandpa from that video my girlfriend showed me last night? Man, you've got pipes." And I smiled like a man who drops his hat and pretends he meant to, paid, and walked to the car feeling older than the keys in my palm. I started sleeping in the spare room at Claire's when I visited so that I wouldn't fall asleep in the recliner, where a phone might be waiting. And on those evenings I taped my mouth and positioned pillows and used the white noise machine. But the house has its own ecosystem, and I learned that humiliation circulates through vents just like laughter. And late one night when I went to the kitchen for water, I found Aidan's tripod still extended in the living room like a scarecrow that had learned to stand indoors, and he came down the stairs and told me to chill. He'd been filming a reaction, and I told him that from now on the rule was simple: no cameras without my permission, not in the house, not in the yard, not in the car. And he shrugged and said it was the public space when the family gathered, and I said then I would withdraw from that public and make my own private, and he rolled his eyes so hard he could have seen the back of his head. Money is the language families use when they cannot speak plainly about love, and I knew that if I didn't translate my boundaries into that language, no one would bother to read them. So I told Claire that I was pausing my contributions for the remainder of the semester until Aidan removed the video and apologized. Not a performative sorry captured for his followers, but an apology spoken to my face with the door closed, and she looked at me with the wounded surprise of a person who had counted on one thing staying true while everything else wobbled, And she said the tuition deadlines didn't wait for feelings and that I was picking a petty hill to die on. And I said gently that this was not a petty hill to me, but the ground on which a man stands up or does not stand up, and that if humiliation is the fee for family, then we had mispriced the product. She left angry, called later to say she understood my point, but my timing was cruel, and I told her that timing had not seemed to concern anyone when the upload button was pressed at my expense. The next day, Aidan posted a second clip, not of me sleeping, but of himself, performing my snore with theatrical gusto in a grocery aisle, while his friend panned past a stack of denture cream, the captions full of LOLs and one of them reading Grandpa. Challenge, and for a while the internet did what it does when it smells fresh meat. It moved on to other grandpas and other challenges. And yet, in our house, the echo remained, because you cannot challenge a person's dignity in public and then expect the private air to return immediately to the temperature of kindness. I tried again to catch Aidan alone, not to scold him, but to look him in the eyes long enough that he remembered the boy I knew. And I told him that when I was his age, a man's reputation lived in the faces of the people on his street, and now his reputation lived in clouds over which he had no dominion, and that one day he would find himself on the wrong side of a joke, and he would discover how quickly even his own laughter could turn against him. And he said life was different now, and that old people always complain the new world is cruel because it isn't shaped like their youth. And I said that cruelty doesn't change its name just because the fonts are modern. And he shrugged and told me I took things too far for views I didn't even have to see. On Friday there was a scrimmage at the school, and I went because I still believed in showing up. And as I sat on the bleachers, I heard a group of boys behind me whisper the sound they think old men make when they're inconvenient, then start a rhythm of snorts like a campfire song, and I considered turning around and saying, "That's my voice you're borrowing. Return it when you're done." But I knew they would never understand that a body's noise is not the sum of the person who lives inside it. I stayed through the fourth quarter and clapped for both teams because a small part of me will always insist on being decent, even when decency has not been extended to me. Then went home and stood in the kitchen with my hands flat on the counter and understood that something in me had crossed from pleading to planning. The planning was not grand or cinematic. It began with small domestic resolutions that felt like laying sandbags against a river I could finally name. And I wrote on a sheet of paper in my big block letters the terms by which I would continue to participate in this household. No filming without consent, no posting that uses my name or image, no jokes at my expense in front of guests, and an acknowledgement that money is not owed but given. And I read it to Claire and to Aidan and to her husband when he came home, and the husband said I was making rules like a landlord and the house was not mine, and I said, then perhaps I should act like a tenant who can break his lease, and Claire told me I was turning a teachable moment into a power struggle, and I said I had been taught enough for one lifetime. They did not sign anything. There was no ceremony, but they also did not laugh in that instant, which I took as the first concession in a war no one wanted to admit was happening. That night I sat in the spare room with the CPAP humming like a steady friend, and I watched the shadow of the maple tree move across the wall, and for the first time since the video, I felt the strange clarity that comes when the worst has already happened and you discover the world did not end, but simply kept going without your permission. And in that clarity I heard, or believed I heard, a faint echo of my own snore from somewhere down the hallway where no one was sleeping yet, as if the house had swallowed the sound and learned to burp it back at me, and I thought, not unkindly, that the future had announced itself and that if I did not author a response, it would author me. What I did not do was forgive, not yet, not because I confuse forgiveness with weakness, but because forgiveness without contrition becomes permission. And I had finally learned the difference the hard way. I carried myself differently in the days. After that, not grandly, not with a chip on my shoulder, but with the quiet firmness of a man who has decided not to barter his self-respect for a seat at his own table. And the household noticed, which is to say the jokes grew fewer and the phones, for a time, faced other directions, though the world outside still buzzed with its appetite, and now and then The doorbell rang, and some kid from the neighborhood, emboldened by likes, would ask if I could do the sound for a selfie, and I would say, "Son, the only sound you're going to hear from me today is the door closing, and close it with the gentleness that proves you do not need to slam a door for it to be heard." I went on showing up at church, at ball games, at dinners where the food tasted like compromise, and every so often I caught Aiden watching me with a look that might have been annoyance and might have been curiosity, and I decided to believe it was the latter, because a man needs a small story to tell himself at bedtime, otherwise the darkness feels like a verdict. And on the night when I finally slept, really slept, I dreamed not of laughter or of applause, but of a metronome ticking in an empty room, and I woke with the knowledge that I had become that metronome, the slow, steady beat that refuses to change its time signature just because the band got louder, and it was then, before the midpoint, before any reckoning you could set to music, that the idea began to form of how a sound once made can be returned to the maker, not to injure but to educate, not to terrorize but to teach. And I held that thought the way a boy holds a firefly in a jar, not shaking it, not showing it off, just watching it glow and waiting for the moment when its own light would tell me what to do next. It was on a Thursday evening, the kind of evening when the house feels less like shelter and more like an archive of everything unsaid, that the middle of this storm revealed itself, because the world outside my walls had already consumed the video of me snoring. But what burned deeper was that the echo of that humiliation had become the soundtrack inside these very rooms, and no matter how carefully I tried to act as if nothing had changed, the truth was that something had, and it showed itself in the way Aiden started treating me, not as a grandfather who once wiped applesauce from his chin, but as a piece of old furniture that could be mocked whenever silence grew too long. That night Claire invited me again for dinner, perhaps out of habit, perhaps out of guilt, and I went because an old man goes where he is asked, even when the invitation sounds more like an obligation. And when I sat down at the table, Aiden had a Bluetooth speaker hidden beneath his chair, and halfway through the meal, when conversation paused, he pressed play, and the sound that filled the dining room was not music, but my own guttural breathing looped into a grotesque rhythm, and everyone froze for half a second before laughter cracked open the quiet like glass under a boot, even Claire, who put her hand to her mouth as if trying to stop it, but still let the sound leak between her fingers. And in that moment, I felt that the floor beneath me was tilting, and that my place in this family had shifted from participant to prop. I pushed back my chair without a word, the scrape of wood against tile the only defiance I could muster, and I walked to the porch where the air smelled of damp leaves and gasoline, and I stood there looking at the sky that had no answers for me, my hands trembling not from the cold but from the certainty that respect, once lost, does not return by itself. It must be clawed back or replaced with distance. After a while, Claire came out, her voice soft and almost tender, saying, "Dad, you can't let him get under your skin. He's just being a teenager." And I told her quietly that this was not a teenage prank, but a betrayal of the blood bond, that when your own grandson finds more joy in your ridicule than in your presence, something fundamental has broken. And she sighed and said I was exaggerating, that in the modern world people laugh at everything, and I told her I was not asking the world for dignity, only my family, and if they could not give it to me, then perhaps I had no place left at their table. She didn't answer, and the silence between us was heavier than any argument could have been. That night I drove back to my own house and sat in the recliner, staring at the blank screen of the television, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen louder than my thoughts. And I realized that what had begun as a joke had hardened into a narrative, a story being told about me that I had no authorship over, a story where I was the bumbling old man, the snoring fool, the caricature to be played for laughs, and the worst part was that my own flesh and blood were the narrators. I thought of Delia, of how she would have slammed her palm on the table and told them all to shut up and remember who built the roof over their heads, who carried their tears when they were small. And I longed for her voice, for her steel, but she was gone, and all that was left was me, and I felt the loneliness of that absence in a way that burned hotter than any ridicule. The next day I received a message from a man I barely knew, a fellow parishioner at church, who wrote me that his teenage daughter had shared the video on her feed, and he thought I should be aware that Grandpa's Snore Challenge was now a trend among local kids, and that my grandson's name was being celebrated for starting it. I stared at that message until the letters blurred, until my eyes watered, not from grief, but from the sheer absurd cruelty of it, that my involuntary noise, the very breath of my body, had become a circus act for children I had never met, and that my own blood had volunteered me for the role. I sat down at the table and wrote on a scrap of paper, "Dignity is the last inheritance," and I pinned it to the fridge as if it were a commandment I needed to repeat every morning before making my coffee. It was then that the anger, which had until that point been scattered like sparks, gathered itself into a steady flame, and I decided that I could no longer afford to wait for apologies or for the tide of embarrassment to ebb on its own, because time is not generous to men in their 70s, and each day you spend humiliated is a day you never get back. I began to carry myself differently, not with arrogance, but with a deliberate quiet, a refusal to play the fool, and in that stillness I noticed how it unsettled Aidan, how he stopped meeting my eyes at dinner, how his laughter grew forced when he tried to imitate me as if my silence had thrown his cruelty off balance. Claire, too, began to watch me more carefully, perhaps sensing that something inside me had shifted, that I was no longer the pliant father who would nod and forgive, but a man who had drawn an invisible line he would not let them cross again. The midpoint of this ordeal, the moment when I understood that the story had tipped into something irreversible, came not in a shout but in a whisper of realization that my family had chosen to treat me as content instead of kin, as material instead of memory, and that if I wanted to reclaim even a shred of my dignity, I would have to teach them the value of silence, of fear, of sleeplessness. For I had given them my labor, my money, my years of presence, but I still possessed the one thing that could not be taken from me without consent, my resolve. And that night, as I lay awake with the CPAP mask humming on my face like a machine trying to keep me alive, I promised myself that I would not die a clown in their circus, that if my grandson thought he could turn my sleep into a performance, then he would learn what it was to fear his own sleep, to lie in bed with the dark pressing against his chest, to discover that dreams can be haunted not by ghosts but by the living who refuse to be mocked any more. That was the turning point, the quiet contract I signed with myself in the dark, that the days of passive endurance were over, that what had been stolen from me, my respect, my authority, my simple right to exist without ridicule, would be reclaimed, not by shouting at a dinner table, but by making the very air of their nights tremble, until the same boy who uploaded my snores for laughter would pray in his bed for silence. And only then, when he tasted that silence, would he understand what he had taken from me. The plan did not arrive as a blueprint, but as a murmur I at first mistook for anger and then recognized as resolve, and it moved through my days with the same quiet patience as the river across from the mill where I worked years ago, unnoticed until you realized the bank had been eaten away. I began by paying attention to the little conveniences this house had adopted while I was still learning to be a widower. The smart speaker Claire bought on a sale weekend and plugged into the hall so she could call out reminders while juggling grocery bags, the mesh of devices tied to a family account I had helped pay for, without ever asking how it all fit together. The way Aidan paired his phone to every speaker, the way a cat marks furniture, and it occurred to me that humiliation, once turned into sound, could travel along those same invisible wires, and that a boy so proud of broadcasting other people's noises might learn a different kind of pride if the night answered him back. I will not pretend I didn't hesitate, because Delia's voice still lives in the random corners of my conscience, and when I first imagined letting my snore pass under his door like a draft at 3 a.m, I saw her shaking her head and telling me that vengeance rarely sleeps in the bed you make for it. Yet the memory of his friends in our kitchen braying along to a loop of my breathing while I tried to cut my meat with a steady hand pressed harder than the ghost of her. Disapproval, and after a long walk that finished the argument, my better angels were too tired to win. I acted not like a criminal picking a lock, but like a grandfather who has finally accepted that lectures only fatten the appetite of mockery, and I set the house to a new rhythm that belonged to me. The first night I chose mercy disguised as chance, a brief thread of sound woven into the silence just after 3, the same rasping inhale he had captured and blessed with captions, a whisper at first, then a shade louder when the night remembered. It knew my name, and I allowed it to run only long enough to make doubt nibble at the edges of a teenage brain that had never been left alone with itself for long. In the morning he came to the table hollow-eyed and testy, blaming the neighbor's dog, or the heater, and when Claire suggested white noise, he announced that was the problem. Too noisy, and I sipped my coffee and said nothing, because a man learns that some victories need the cover of silence the way seedlings need the darkness of soil. 2 nights later I let the sound return, not a loop this time, but a living rhythm with breath between the notes, a human imperfection he would recognize the way a hunter recognizes his own boot prints, and by the end of the week the bravado in his. Shoulders had thinned, he pushed away plates still half full, and he dozed on the couch after school with his phone on his chest like a life preserver that had lost its air, and when he woke, he snapped at Claire for moving his backpack and told me to stop looking at him as if I were measuring him for a coffin. The irony was not lost on me that the boy who had reduced my sleeping body to content was suddenly guarded as a vault about his own, and it occurred to me that anyone who feeds on public laughter must privately fear mirrors. On Saturday his team played a rival school, and the coach benched him by halftime because he was a step slow, his shots short, his temper long. And in the parking lot afterward 2 boys from the other side called across the lanes, "Hey, Aiden, here. Anything last night?" And even though their faces were jokers' masks, I heard the tremor of real malice under the paint, which in some other life might have stirred pity in me. But in this one I watched my grandson swallow the humiliation he had been, serving to me in ladles, and I thought that perhaps for the first time in months we were eating from the same pot. That evening, while Claire scraped plates and her husband debated with a helpline about a cable bill that would not stay paid, I took Aiden aside and told him again, without heat, that the video had to come down, not because I demanded retribution or wanted to pretend the internet forgets, but because a man should not be the author of his own curse. And he looked at me with eyes shadowed not just by sleeplessness, but by a dawning awareness that something larger than schoolboys and comments had entered his life, and he said there was too much momentum now to reverse. Advertisers nibbling at the edge of his messages, wanting him to do more grandpa bits with brand placements. Sweatshirt companies asking if he could wear their logo when he did the impression in public, and in that confession the mask fell and the motive stood up and spoke its name, because I saw clearly that the smirk in the living room had always been half hunger, that attention had converted to credit, and credit had begun to smell like cash, and I felt the old furnace in my chest crank open another register, not merely against the insult, but against the willingness to sell out the dignity of the blood that built your house for a discount code. He tried to make it sound harmless, that I would get a cut if we collabed, that people loved me and wanted more, and I told him what I have learned standing graveside and outside hospital doors, that love you have to purchase is a ticket to a show, in which you are never more than the opening act. And he scoffed and said, I didn't understand the new economy, and I told him the economy I understood was the one where a man sleeps without fear of being turned into a joke by his own family. The second blow came from a direction I should have anticipated but still found myself unguarded against, because humiliation rarely travels alone. A deacon from church called to say a few men were concerned that the funny video associated with my name was hurting the witness of our seniors' ministry, and perhaps I might consider asking my grandson to remove it. And when I said that was what I had been doing for weeks, he sighed in that slow, managerial way that lets you know the institution has already decided the individual is inconvenient, and he suggested I take a sabbatical from leading prayer at the Wednesday service until things cooled down. and I thanked him for his candor and did not tell him that I had no intention of returning to a room where men would vote for mercy on Sunday and laughter on Monday. And I sat for a long time after that call with the phone heavy in my palm and understood that Aiden had extended the border of his joke past our kitchen and into the town, and that what I was defending now was not a single man's pride, but the right of old age to exist without being conscripted as a prop. Claire stopped by later with a pastry bag and a face that wanted to apologize without naming the reason. And when I told her about the call, she bristled and said that if I hadn't threatened to withhold tuition, none of this would have escalated. And I reminded her gently that my condition had been clear and simple, an apology and the removal of the clip, and that she had chosen to treat my boundary as leverage to be outweighted rather than as a moat to be respected. And she told me I was turning into a stranger in my own family, and I told her the family had turned me into a stranger first, when it decided the most intimate noises of my body were fair use. Meanwhile, the nights did their steady work, and I adjusted nothing because I didn't have to. The boy's own mind had begun replaying the sound after the speakers fell quiet, and he came to breakfast with a wild, frustrated expression that might have been anger and might have been fear, saying he heard it even when the house was still, that the moment the light went out it rose from the rug like a draft. And Claire booked a pediatrician to calm him, and the doctor mentioned sleep hygiene and screens and perhaps a short course of melatonin, and I said nothing, because there is a thin moral line between teaching and torment, and I was determined to walk it like a man crossing a rope bridge in wind, and I let the night teach the lesson, without adding so much as a finger on the scale. When he caught a head cold and the snore-like wheeze migrated into his own chest, the irony became too bitter for him to ignore, and the first time he startled himself awake with a noise that sounded made by someone twice his age, he threw the blanket, as if it were a net, and stumbled to the bathroom in a panic. And when he came out, he found me in the hallway with the hall light low, and he stared at me the way a boy stares at weather, looking for signs. And for a moment, I almost reached out to him, as a frightened child, but then I remembered the ring of boys in the kitchen, and I let my hand stay at my side and said only that the body has ways of reminding you that you are not the author of everything that happens to you. By then his little empire of comments had turned against him because the internet always turns, and the scent of fatigue attracted predators, kids from 2 schools over, stitching his old video with fresh clips of him yawning in class and missing free. Throws, the caption changing from legend to washed at 17, and he discovered a fact I have known since my first day on a factory line, that the crowd claps for your climb only because it makes the stumble funnier. And when I heard him slam his bedroom door and tell his friends he was taking a break to focus on mental health, some leftover tenderness in me surfaced, and I went to the porch to stand where Delia used to collect our daughter's shoes after thunderstorms. And I asked the sky, if this was justice or cruelty, wearing justice's coat, and the sky, as usual, kept its counsel. Claire's husband, who had kept himself apart from the heart of this wound with the tidy neutrality of a man who counts costs for a living, finally found a use for his voice and came to my house with a printout of college fees and the righteous anger of a bookkeeper accusing me of weaponizing money to shape Aiden's behavior. And I told him I was simply refusing to sponsor my own degradation. And he said that a man who lets a teenager's prank get under his skin must be lonely. And I said, I had never been lonelier than the night I watched my family laugh at me from 3 feet away, as if the table were a moat. I would like to say that guilt slowed me, but it did not because I am heartless, but because the sight of that boy stumbling through his days with the exhaustion he had once assigned to me hardened into proof that the lesson was finally engraving itself, and the next escalation did not come from me, but from their side when Claire proposed a truce on terms that told me she was still counting rather than listening. A staged apology video in which Aiden would tearfully admit he had gone too far. I would nod with moist eyes. The Brands would love the redemption arc. The clip would earn enough to cover a semester, and then we would all move on. And I stared at her across the same table where the speaker had rattled my fork and told her I would not be turned into a prop for the cleanup of a mess I had not made, that forgiveness was a private sacrament, not a public content strategy. And she flushed and said I was punishing her for being a single mother who needed help. And I answered, with the gentleness that comes from having carried groceries into rooms you paid for, that I had been helping all along. But help had a cost now, and the cost was respect, payable in advance. She left in a storm that rattled the hallway picture frames, and later that night I received a text I assume she did not mean to send to me, a screenshot of a message thread with the brand boy promising a bonus if the apology crossed 1 million views, and I put the phone face down on the table and laughed once without humor, because there was the naked truth, my teaching wage quoted in CPM. If there was a moment I feared I had gone too far, it came on a Tuesday when Aiden's guidance counselor called Claire about his attendance, and she forwarded me the voicemail in a rage, lashing me word by word as the root cause of a problem she did not want to name, and for a brittle hour I considered ending my campaign and allowing sleep to return to his room unconditionally. Yet when I pictured him at that kitchen table with his thumb hovering over the publish button while I slept in a chair with my mouth open, I remembered that dignity is not a gift you hand to a repentant thief as soon as he looks miserable. It is a thing you require him to learn to guard. And learning takes time, more time than a week of poor grades and headaches. And so I held the line not with glee, but the way a surgeon holds a stitch that must pull flesh together if a wound is to close. And I told myself a story that soothed and alarmed me at once, that sometimes mercy arrives disguised as consequence. The nights were not crueler, merely persistent, and I began to notice that the sound did not have to play long any more for his mind to summon it, the way a man with tremors anticipates the spill before his hand actually shakes. And in the morning he would look at me across the toast rack as if he were trying to decide whether I was his tormentor or his teacher. And I did not help him decide, because the truth lived uneasily in both words and would not separate until he did his own work. The revelation of motives was completed for me, if not for him, when I found a crumpled contract in the recycling bin under a sleeve of soda cans, a sponsorship deal that named me, without naming me, a senior Snore series requiring 3 new pieces, a week with a clause about escalation of creative stakes, and a bonus if a live appearance could be arranged at the mall, and my name was not printed anywhere but the silhouette in the mock-ups could only be me, right down to the battered recliner, and the too big cardigan, and my vision went white around the edges the way it did the night I got the call about Delia in the ER, and I pulled the paper out with shaking hands and folded it along its creases until the words disappeared into an ugly square. And I understood then not only what my grandson had become willing to do for attention, but what my daughter had become willing to permit to solve a bill, and I felt the last shabby tie of sentiment snap, replaced by something that did not feel like hatred so much as a sober clarity you reach when a bridge collapses under you, and you realize you cannot go back. I did not confront them with the paper because I wanted them, for once, to confront themselves, to discover that the absence of my patience was not an empty seat but a mirror. And I went home that night to my own quiet rooms, and I sat on the edge of my bed with the CPAP straps in my hand, and I said out loud to a woman who was not there that I was sorry it had come to this, and that if I had failed somewhere earlier, I was trying at least to fail now in the direction of a hard lesson that might keep a boy from growing into a man who believes other people's frailty is a ladder. The next morning the house was pale with a kind of truce light that used to mean snow was on the way, and Aiden came to the door without his phone in his hand, and he did not sit but leaned against the frame, and in a voice that surprised me with its inch of childhood asked me if I ever got scared to close my eyes, and I told him yes. I had been scared the first year after Delia died because I was worried the house would forget my name while I slept, and that I would wake up a stranger in my own life. And he nodded and stared at the floor and said he hadn't slept more than an hour at a time for days, and that he heard it even when he wore earbuds. And I told him the body can amplify the sounds you feed it, that attention is a kind of fertilizer whether you pour it on flowers or weeds, and he said, almost angrily, that he wished he had never made the video, that the likes weren't worth it. And for the first time since this began, I felt not victory but a complicated tenderness, like The one you feel when a fever breaks at dawn and you see your child drenched and weak, but still your child. And I told him sometimes the only way out of a mess is through the middle of it with your eyes open. And he looked at me, and I could see the question he didn't yet know how to ask, whether I was the one making his nights heavy, and I did not answer it yet. Because the story wasn't finished, because the lesson had not yet reached the part where knowledge becomes choice, and I knew the next turn would demand from both of us something more than endurance, something like confession and something like mercy, and the old clock in my hallway, the one that drags its hands through the minute, seemed to tick louder, as if urging us toward the moment when all the sound we had made would come home and stand between us like a witness waiting to be sworn. It happened on a night when even the air in the house seemed to listen, heavy and expectant, as if it too had grown weary of carrying the weight of mockery and silence. I had decided that the time for half measures was over, that whatever I had been whispering into the shadows of his sleep until now had been a prelude, a rehearsal, for the moment when the stage would finally demand a performance of truth. Aidan had grown accustomed to the haunting, though it was breaking him down, and I could see the rings beneath his eyes deepening, his laughter with friends thinning into nervous twitches. Yet he still clung to bravado during the day, still dared to imitate me at the table even when his voice cracked from exhaustion. That night I prepared differently. Instead of letting the familiar loop of my breath carry through the speakers, I layered it with fragments of words, distorted whispers shaped from my own voice, but slowed and deepened until they sounded less like speech and more like conscience. "Why?" the whisper asked, long and drawn out, merging with the sound of snoring, so that the line between body and accusation blurred. "Why did you laugh? Why did you betray?" It was not loud, but it did not need to be. It was the kind of sound that does not strike the ear so much as the spine. At 2 a.m, I heard the muffled thud of his feet on the floorboards above me, the hurried slam of his door, and the panicked cry muffled into his pillow. Claire rushed in, her voice frantic, asking what was wrong, and he shouted at her that he couldn't sleep, that he heard things, that the house was not quiet even when it was silent. She tried to comfort him with the words of mothers everywhere, just a dream, just your imagination. But I could hear in her tone that she too felt something unnatural pressing in, something she could not explain away. For the first time since this began, the laughter had left her completely. In the morning, when I came to the kitchen, she looked at me with suspicion, as if she had begun to wonder whether the silence around me was not silence at all, but orchestration. She asked me directly if I had anything to do with what was happening, if I had tampered with the house, if I was somehow tormenting her son, and I told her with a calm that must have unnerved her that I had done nothing more than remind him of the sound he had once shared with the world. Her eyes narrowed, and she whispered that I was cruel, but I reminded her that cruelty had started when a boy turned his grandfather into a joke for strangers, and that if she had stopped him then, none of this would have been necessary. That day passed in a fog of unease. Aidan refused to leave his room, refused to eat, and when his friends messaged him, he snapped back in rage until they stopped trying. I saw in him the same isolation that had been forced upon me, and for a moment I felt pity. But I did not relent because the lesson was not yet complete. That night I gave him the final act, a sound not of snoring, not of whispers, but of silence broken by the sudden gasp of a man catching his breath after drowning. It filled the house at 3 a.m, a single sound, stretched and distorted, echoing as if it came from the walls themselves. And then it vanished into absolute stillness. Moments later I heard his scream, raw, unguarded, the scream of a child who had been stripped of the armor of irony, and then the pounding of his fists against his mother's door. Claire shouted at me then, shouted that I had gone too far, that I was destroying him, but I did not answer. I sat in my chair, the CPAP humming at my side, staring at the dark window where my own reflection looked back at me like a stranger I had finally met. In the morning, Aidan came down pale and trembling, and for the first time since this began, he did not mock me, did not avoid my eyes. He sat across from me at the table, his hands shaking as he lifted his spoon, and then he put it down and whispered, "I'm sorry." The words were so soft that Claire almost didn't hear them, but I did, and I felt the house itself exhale as if the very walls had been waiting for that confession. I looked at him steadily and told him that apologies were seeds, not fruit, and that if he wanted forgiveness, he would need to tend to it every day, not with words, but with respect. He nodded, and tears slid down his cheeks, tears he did not bother to hide, and in that moment I knew that the balance had shifted, that the boy who had mocked me before thousands of strangers had been brought low by the same sound. He thought, harmless, and that he would never again close his eyes without remembering that dignity, once mocked, can return as a ghost in the night. In the days that followed his apology, the house loosened its grip on the terrible quiet it had learned, and the clocks sounded like clocks again instead of verdicts. Yet I knew the story would not close by drifting into ordinary time, so I asked Aidan to walk with me at dusk along the narrow strip of grass behind the house where the maples have always kept the last light, as if they were reluctant to hand it over. And when we reached the corner, I told him plainly and without theater that the nights he feared were not a haunting in the supernatural sense, but a lesson I had authored, because every conversation had failed, that I had used the same wires he once used to parade me before strangers, that I had placed my breath in the air, around his bed the way he had placed my body in the air around this town, and that I had done it not to break him, but to make visible the weight his laughter had put on me. He stood very still and looked for a long time at the chain-link fence as if it could answer for him, then asked whether I would stop, and I said I would, because seeds do not need floodwater once they have split, and because a man does not teach mercy by refusing to practice it. Back inside, I unplugged the speakers and reset the accounts and erased the files, and I put the little white noise machine I used after Delia died into his hands, and told him that if he wanted sleep now, he would have to help it find him, not by drowning the world, but by telling his own mind a better story about the dark. Claire watched from the doorway with her arms crossed, her mouth pulled into that thin line she learned in corporate training, and when Aidan went upstairs, she asked me, what kind of man frightens a boy to make a point, and I answered that the kind who has been laughed at by his own house and has run out of gentler methods, the kind who would rather be judged than erased, and I told her the terms by which I would remain in their lives. The video would be deleted across platforms. Every download he could reach would be asked, firmly, politely, to remove it. There would be a private apology to me and a separate one to the seniors group at church, whose calls I had stopped taking. There would be a rule about phones and consent that would be announced and enforced by her, and there would be no financial support until a year had passed without a single violation. If they could meet that year straight through, I said I would help with tuition again, not because money is love, but because love sometimes takes the shape of a bill paid after respect has been paid first. She called it extortion dressed as parenting, and I did not argue with the names because people who feel accused begin by naming the weather, not their umbrellas. Instead, I gathered my coat and said I'd sleep in my own house that night, and that they were welcome to visit on Sundays at 2 if they wished to talk like people who remember they belong to each other. The next morning I sat with Pastor Jim and told him what had happened, the part about the video and the part about the nights, and I said I would not take the Wednesday prayer again for a while, but I would like to start something small in the fellowship hall. No speeches, no microphones, just a table with coffee where teenagers could come listen to old men tell one true story, each about the moment they realized they were no longer jokes in their own skin. He looked at me as if I had handed him a tool he had been looking for and called it Dignity Night, which sounded corny to my ear until I stood in that room a week later and saw 4 boys in hoodies and 1 girl in a softball jacket sit down with paper cups and try the new habit of not laughing first. Aidan did not come that week, but he came the next, and he did not sit with me. He sat with Mr. Lane, who worked the railroad and now walks with a cane, and I watched from across the room as my grandson heard a man describe the day a foreman cut him down with words in front of a crew, and how long it took for his palms to stop sweating whenever. He heard boots on gravel. After the circle broke, Aidan helped stack chairs without being asked, and when we reached the door he said he had deleted what he could and written to the rest, that a few had mocked him for going soft, and I told him that sometimes the only thing softer than apology is a spine that refuses to bend where it bent before. Over the next months, a new routine formed, not because any of us turned saintly, but because we enforced small rules, the way you corral ivy, reminding it where the house ends, phones in the basket when we eat, no cameras when people sleep, no public. Talk about private bodies, and when slip-ups happened, they were named and repaired, and I saw that Aiden's sleep returned in cautious increments. A patchwork made of good nights and careful ones, never again the careless drop into darkness he had before, and I admit there was a part of me that hoped he would carry a thread of wakefulness with him forever, not as punishment, but as a guardrail that keeps a person from driving other people off the road. I kept my part as well. I sat with Martin the lawyer and rewrote my will, shifting the center of it from heirs who treat love as an ATM to a modest scholarship at the community college for kids who care for their elders at home. And I left a separate letter for Aiden in an envelope that says, "Open only when you can sleep without hearing anyone else's breath." And inside it, I put the brass key to my workshop and a note that the only inheritance that matters is the set of things a man can fix with his hands and the set of things he refuses to break with his mouth. When Claire found out about the scholarship, she accused me of choosing strangers over blood. And I told her that blood is what you prove by how you hold the person who made you when they are weakest. For a while she stayed away. Then she began to arrive on Sundays at 2 with a pie from a store she pretended was homemade, and we spoke in the even tones of people who are trying to relearn each other's grammar. And sometimes the conversation failed, and sometimes it landed, and in those rare landings I heard Delia's old Grace set a chair for us at the table. As for the world beyond our fence, it moved on, as it always does, but the town never quite forgot what happened, and I could feel when I passed the pharmacy that a few smiles bent warmer and a few boys dropped their eyes, which is a small justice, but a justice nonetheless. And on the night Aiden turned 18, he knocked on my door without texting first, stood awkwardly in the entryway, and told me he still heard it sometimes right before sleep. Not the snore, but the breath that comes after. Drowning, and I told him that was only the sound of a conscience clearing its throat, and that a man can live with that kind of companion and even be grateful for it, because it reminds him to keep other people's dignity upright in his hands. Later, in my own bed, with the mask humming and the old clock dragging its hand through the minute, I thought about titles and endings and all the ways a family can be revised without being erased, and I understood that he might never sleep as peacefully as before, and neither do I, but the peace we make now is not the oblivion of the young or the numbness of the humiliated. It is the kind you earn when you return the sound you took, accept the cost, and choose night after unglamorous. Night, to leave each other's breathing alone,